The case of the Scottsboro Boys is one of the most famous trials of the early 20th century. No other crime in American history has resulted in as many trials, retrials, appeals, and reversals as the case of the Scottsboro Boys, particularly not in a case where the crime never happened. The trials attracted both national and international controversy and highlighted the blatant inequities and discrimination plaguing the American South during the 1930s. The case of the Scottsboro Boys began March 25, 1931. 9 young black men and boys hopped onto a Southern Railway train in search of work in Memphis, Tennessee. The youngest was Roy Wright and Eugene Williams, who were both 13 at the time. The other boys were Charlie Weems, 19, Haywood Patterson, 18, Olin Montgomery, 17, Willie Robertson, 17, and Ozzie Powell, 16. While aboard the train, a fight broke out between the black boys and a group of white boys. The fight began near Stevenson, Alabama, and the black teams succeeded in throwing all but one of the white antagonists off the train. However, some of the boys who were kicked off the train ran back to the Stevenson train station and accused the black youths of assaulting them. When the train stopped in Paint Rock, Alabama, a posse of armed men rounded up every black youth they could find. The 9 teenagers captured were taken to a jail in Scottsboro, Alabama, where they would soon be named the Scottsboro Boys. Also on board the train were 2 young women, Victoria Price, aged 21, and Ruby Bates, aged 17. Bates, albeit a minor, had a history of prostitution, and Price, a woman of questionable history and background, was described by an old neighbor as being no more than a common street prostitute. In fear of being charged with vagrancy as a result of their failure to purchase a train ticket, one of the girls, either in response to a question or by her own initiative, told one of the armed men that they had been raped by a group of black men with pistols and knives. News of the accusation spread fast through the community. A mob of several hundred men surrounded the Scottsboro jail the night of the arrest with hopes of lynching the boys. This plan failed as Alabama Governor B.M. Miller ordered the National Guard to Scottsboro to protect the suspects. The all-white Jackson County grand jury met in Scottsboro on March 30th and indicted the 9 boys and charged them with rape. The boys were never able to contact their families before their trials and were given only an hour to consult their attorneys. The trials of the Scottsboro Boys began in the courtroom of Judge A. E. Hawkins. Stephen Roddy and Milo Moody were chosen to represent the boys. Rudy was a drunk real estate attorney of Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was not well versed in Alabama law and had no experience in criminal law. Moody was a 70-year-old local attorney who had not tried a case in decades. Representing the state and the girls was Circuit Solicitor H. G. Bailey. The boys were grouped and tried in 4 separate cases. For each trial, there was an all-white jury. The first trial was that of Charlie Weems and Clarence Norris, which began April 6, 12 days after their original arrest. The prosecution's case heavily relied on Victoria Price's testimony. Price, in cross-examination, was very evasive in her answering. She often either pretended not to understand a question or lied. The prosecutor's weak witnesses were Ruby Bates and Orville Gilley. Gilley was the white youth who remained on the train with the Scottsboro Boys. Both were less confident on the stand than Price, and neither's testimony fit in with the positive identification of the accused defendants and the account of events given by Victoria's testimony. Dr. R. Bridges was called to the stand by the prosecutor to describe the injuries that the girls sustained during their alleged rape. The doctor testified that he only found a few small bruises and scratches, and he described Price as being not lacerated at all. He also disclosed that there were no blood found on either of the girls, and that they had no internal damages consistent with rape. Neither were upset when being examined, and both held calm composures. The defense only called 2 witnesses to the stand, their clients Charlie Weems and Clarence Norris. Charlie Weems testified that although he had been a part of the fight on the train, he had not raped anyone and he had not seen any women on the train. Clarence Norris, on the other hand, testified that a gang rape had taken place, but he was the only one who did not participate. At a later time, Norris explained that his false testimony came from the fear that he was going to be killed by the guards and by the mob outside the courtroom if he didn't confess. Haywood Patterson's trial had already begun when the jury announced the Weems-Norris verdict. On April 7th, it took less than 2 hours for the jury to find the 2 boys, Charlie Weems and Clarence Norris, guilty and sentence them to death by the electric chair. Haywood Patterson's trial went about the same as the Weems-Norris trial, and after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the death penalty verdict. The third trial, which began only minutes after the last on April 8th, tried Olin Montgomery, Ozzie Powell, Willie Robertson, Eugene Williams, and Andy Wright. New evidence from this trial showed that Willie Robertson suffered from a bad case of syphilis, In other words, it made it extremely painful, if not impossible, for him to have committed the act he was accused of doing. New evidence also showed that Allen Montgomery was nearly blind, making Montgomery seem unlikely to have committed the crime he was accused of doing as well. The case went to the jury at 4 p.m. on April 8th, and early the next morning, the jury called for the death penalty on all 5 boys. The fourth trial, which began on April 9th, was that of the youngest Scottsboro boy, Roy Wright. This was the only trial where the state asked for life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. But at afternoon's end, the jury deadlocked 11-1. For 11 jurors favored the death penalty and 1 for life imprisonment. Judge Hawkins declared a mistrial. Surprisingly, the NAACP did not rush to the defense of the Scottsboro boys. They feared that if the boys turned out to be guilty, then the NAACP would lose its credibility and effectiveness. It was, in fact, the Communist Party that stepped in to take the Scottsboro boys' case as their own. They saw the case as the perfect opportunity to recruit and unite Southern blacks and Northern liberals. The legal arm of the Communist Party, the International Labor Defense, or the ILD, succeeded in their efforts to be named as the attorneys for the Scottsboro boys. With the help of the ILD, the case was appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court January of 1932. However, in a 6-1 vote, the court affirmed all but one of the 8 convictions and death sentences. The cases were then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, who overturned the conviction in Powell v. Alabama. In a 7-2 decision, the court declared that the right of the defendant, granted in the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause to competent legal counsel, had been denied by Alabama, and that there would be new trials for all the Scottsboro boys. The prosecutor for the new trials was Alabama's newly elected Attorney General, Thomas Knight, Jr. The new defense attorney was selected by the ILD, and they chose Samuel Leibowitz to serve as the lead defense attorney. Leibowitz was a renowned New York criminal attorney who secured a record of 77 acquittals and 1 hung jury and a total of 78 murder trials. 9 months after the original trials, Ruby Bates wrote a letter to her then-boyfriend confessing that she had lied about being raped. She later made an appearance in Haywood Patterson's second trial, in which she recanted her original story. From 1993 to 1938, the boys faced retrials, mistrials, convictions, overrulings, reductions in sentencing, paroles being granted, and paroles being denied. Meanwhile, protests advocating for the release of the boys spring up around the nation. In Ozzie Powell's retrial in 1937, he pleaded guilty to assault and the rape charges were dropped. He was later paroled in 1946. In 1936, during Haywood Patterson's retrial, he was convicted of rape and sentenced to 75 years in prison. He then escaped in 1949 and was arrested when the FBI found him in Michigan in 1950. The governor, however, refused to extradite him. In 1951, he was convicted of manslaughter after a bar brawl turned deadly and was sent to prison where he died of cancer 1 year later. In 1937, during Charlie Williams' retrial, he was convicted and sentenced to 105 years. After being held in prison for an overall total of 12 years, he was paroled in 1943. In Andy Wright's retrial, he was convicted and sentenced to 99 years. He was paroled but returned to prison after violating parole. He was later paroled in New York in 1950. Alabama dropped all charges for Roy Wright, Eugene Williams, Allen Montgomery, and Willie Robertson in 1937, all of whom had been in prison for 6 years. Roy Wright went on to join the Army and had a career as a merchant marine. However, in 1959, convinced that his wife had been unfaithful to him during his tour, Wright shot and killed her before shortly killing himself. In 1937, in Clarence Norris's retrial, he was convicted of rape. He was the only Scottsboro boy to be sentenced to death again. However, the governor of Alabama commuted his death sentence to life. After being given parole in 1946, he went into hiding. It wasn't until 1976 he was found in Brooklyn, where the governor of New York pardoned him. Norris was the last living Scottsboro boy. He died January 23, 1989, due to Alzheimer's disease. November 22, 2013, the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles posthumously pardoned Charlie Williams, Andy Wright, and Haywood Patterson. They were the last 3 of the Scottsboro boys to have their convictions cleared from the official record.